In the autumn of 1858, a small wooden church in rural Mississippi held a secret ceremony that would remain buried for over 160 years. Reverend Elias Thornton, a respected preacher known for his fiery sermons about morality and divine order, orchestrated marriages between his 3 sons and women he held in bondage. The unions were recorded in a private ledger, hidden from county officials and never mentioned in public records. The women had no say in these arrangements, forced into relationships that served the preacher's vision of expanding his legacy while maintaining absolute control over both his bloodline and his property. For generations, whispers circulated through black communities in the region about the Thornton secret, but fear and the weight of institutional silence kept the truth confined to oral histories. White descendants of the Thornton family maintained their patriarch's reputation as a moral leader, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, the darkness woven into their heritage. The preacher's church stood for decades as a monument to his supposed righteousness, its walls holding secrets that time seemed determined to protect. Everything changed in 2023, when a restoration crew discovered a metal box sealed behind a false wall in the church basement. Inside lay a collection of daguerreotypes, including one photograph that would shatter carefully constructed narratives. The image showed Reverend Thornton surrounded by his sons and their wives, but the composition told a story that contradicted every official record. The women's faces, captured in silver and shadow, revealed something historians had long suspected but could never prove. These were not willing brides, but enslaved women forced into marriages that existed in a legal and moral void. The discovery sent shockwaves through genealogical communities and sparked a painful reckoning for Thornton descendants on both sides of the color line. DNA testing confirmed what the photograph suggested. Dozens of living people carried the genetic legacy of these forced unions. Some embraced the truth and sought reconciliation, others retreated into denial. But the photograph, preserved against all odds, refused to let the past remain silent. This is the story of how one image, hidden for 165 years, exposed a preacher's twisted program of control and the women whose suffering was erased from history. It's a story about power disguised as piety, about families torn apart by design, and about the resilience of truth in the face of institutional forgetting. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Righteous Man. 150 years ago, in a plantation district near the Yazoo River in Mississippi, few men commanded more respect than Reverend Elias Thornton. His sermons drew crowds from surrounding counties, and his reputation as a moral authority extended far beyond his modest wooden church. To white congregants, he represented the ideal Christian leader, stern but fair, devoted to Scripture, unwavering in his convictions about divine order and social hierarchy. His 3 sons, raised under his strict guidance, were groomed to follow his example and expand his influence throughout the region. But behind the facade of righteousness lay a calculated system of control that would shock even the most cynical observers of the era's brutality. Thornton didn't just own enslaved people, he engineered their lives with the precision of a man who believed himself answerable only to God. By 1856, he had developed what he called his covenant plan, a program designed to ensure his bloodline's continuation, while maintaining absolute dominion over those he held in bondage. The plan required willing participants, and his sons, indoctrinated since childhood, never questioned their father's vision. The preacher's property included 43 enslaved people, among them several young women he had specifically selected for his scheme. Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca, their surnames erased from most records, were between 17 and 20 years old in 1858. They worked in the main house, which meant Thornton had observed them closely for years, evaluating them with the cold calculation of a man choosing breeding stock. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantations mention that Thornton rarely sold or separated families, a practice that earned him praise from some quarters as a humane enslaver. The reality was far more sinister. He was building something he believed would last for generations. In March 1858, Thornton called a private meeting with his sons, Samuel, 24, Joshua, 22, and Nathaniel, 19. What transpired in that meeting was recorded only in fragments, pieced together from later testimonies and the preacher's own coded journal entries. He presented his vision. Each son would enter into a union with one of the selected women. These wouldn't be recognized marriages in the legal sense. State law prohibited such unions, but Thornton insisted they would be blessed before God. The women's children would be their property, ensuring both the continuation of the Thornton line and an expanding labor force perfectly suited to the family's needs. The sons raised no objections. They had been raised to view enslaved people as property, and their father's religious authority made questioning him unthinkable. Samuel was paired with Sarah, a woman who had previously served as the household's primary cook. Joshua was matched with Dinah, who worked in the dairy and gardens. Nathaniel, still a teenager himself, was assigned to Rebecca, the youngest of the three women. None of the women were consulted, warned, or given any choice in the arrangements that would fundamentally alter their lives. On April 14, 1858, in a ceremony held after sunset in the church's main room, Reverend Thornton conducted what he termed a covenant blessing. No county official was present, no legal document was filed. The only record exists in Thornton's private ledger, where he wrote in careful script, "Before the Almighty, 3 unions were consecrated this night, binding flesh to flesh and ensuring the prosperity of our household for generations to come." He hired a traveling photographer, a rare expense that indicated the importance he placed on this moment, to create a permanent record of the occasion. The photograph, a large format daguerreotype, showed the preacher standing at the center, his hands raised in blessing. His 3 sons stood behind him, dressed in their finest clothes, expressions grave and formal. The 3 women stood to the side, their positioning deliberate and telling. They wore simple cotton dresses, not the white gowns of traditional brides. Their faces, captured with the brutal honesty of early photography, revealed no joy or celebration. Sarah's eyes looked past the camera, vacant and distant. Dinah's jaw was set in a tight line of barely contained emotion. Rebecca, the youngest, appeared to be holding back tears. After the ceremony, the photographer was paid and sent away with instructions never to speak of what he had witnessed. The daguerreotype was sealed in a wooden box, along with Thornton's ledger, and hidden in a space the preacher had constructed specifically for this purpose. He told his sons that the photograph would serve as proof of their covenant, to be revealed only when the time was right, a time he believed would come when slavery was universally accepted and his vision vindicated by history. That time never came. Within 3 years, the Civil War would shatter the world Thornton had built. But the photograph, sealed in darkness, would wait over 160 years to tell its truth. Chapter 2. Forced Foundations. The months following the covenant ceremony revealed the true nature of Reverend Thornton's plan. The 3 women, Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca, were moved into separate cabins behind the main house, spaces that had been hastily constructed in the weeks before the ceremony. These cabins stood apart from the slave quarters where other enslaved people lived, a physical separation that reinforced the strange liminal status Thornton had created for the women. They were neither house servants nor field workers, neither legally married nor entirely property anymore, existing in a category the preacher had invented to suit his purposes. Samuel, Joshua, and Nathaniel visited their assigned cabins regularly, following their father's instructions about maintaining the covenant. Contemporary records from neighboring plantations mention that Reverend Thornton frequently spoke about his son's dedication to family duty, though he never explained the true nature of that duty to his white peers. The women had no recourse, no protection, and no escape. They were trapped in relationships backed by absolute power and religious justification that made resistance not just dangerous, but spiritually fraught in the preacher's twisted theology. Sarah became pregnant first, in the summer of 1858. The news pleased Reverend Thornton immensely, and he recorded it in his private ledger with obvious satisfaction. The covenant bears fruit. Samuel's heir grows strong. But Sarah's experience was marked by isolation rather than celebration. Other enslaved women on the property tried to offer support, but Thornton had forbidden social interaction between the covenant women and the rest of the community. He wanted these unions and their offspring marked as separate, special, belonging to a higher purpose than ordinary enslaved people could understand. Dinah followed in early 1859, and Rebecca several months later. By the end of 1859, 3 children had been born into this strange arrangement: Samuel's son Isaac, Joshua's daughter Hannah, and Nathaniel's son Thomas. Thornton insisted on naming the children himself, choosing biblical names he believed would reflect their special status. In his ledger, he recorded their births alongside their mothers' names, but notably, he listed the fathers as his sons, a claim to paternity that would have been legally meaningless, but which Thornton clearly intended as a statement about bloodline and legitimacy. The arrangement created deep tensions within the enslaved community. Some viewed the Covenant women with suspicion, seeing them as collaborators who had gained privileged positions through their forced relationships. Others recognized the truth, that Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca were victims trapped in a particularly cruel form of control. Elderly enslaved people on the property remembered similar arrangements on other plantations, whispered stories of masters and their sons claiming ownership over every aspect of enslaved women's lives, including their reproductive capacity. But Thornton's scheme differed from typical patterns of sexual exploitation. He had formalized it, ritualized it, wrapped it in religious language and photographic evidence. He spoke to his sons about maintaining covenant discipline, which meant treating the women with a kind of cold regularity rather than violent caprice. This calculated approach made the situation even more disturbing. It wasn't spontaneous brutality but methodical programming, a system designed to continue indefinitely. By 1860, the 3 women had given birth again, and Thornton's ledger now documented 6 children born from his covenant plan. He began recording measurements, health observations, and notes about each child's temperament and capabilities. The entries read like livestock records, clinical and detached. He clearly envisioned these children as the foundation of a new labor force, one that combined the Thornton bloodline's supposed superiority with the control he maintained over their mothers. The women themselves left almost no direct record of their thoughts or feelings during this period. Literacy was forbidden, and opportunities for private communication were non-existent under Thornton's watchful eye. But decades later, descendants would preserve oral histories passed down from those who knew them. According to these accounts, Sarah rarely spoke after the birth of her second child. Dinah developed a habit of humming spirituals while she worked, songs about deliverance and freedom that took on desperate meaning. Rebecca, the youngest, reportedly told other enslaved women that she dreamed every night of running north, though she knew such dreams were impossible with children who would be held hostage if she fled. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted Thornton's vision, but didn't immediately end the covenant arrangements. As Mississippi seceded and young white men marched off to war, the preacher intensified his control over the plantation, convinced that God was testing the South's commitment to its social order. His sons, despite being of fighting age, remained at home. Thornton had used his influence to secure exemptions, arguing that they were needed to manage his property and minister to the local community. In reality, he wanted them present to maintain the covenant, to continue the program he had started. Even as the Confederacy crumbled around them, even as enslaved people on neighboring plantations began fleeing toward Union lines, Thornton insisted that his household would remain unchanged. He saw the war as temporary upheaval, convinced that his system, blessed by God and documented in silver, would outlast any military conflict. The 3 women endured, trapped not just by physical barriers but by the children they had been forced to bear. They couldn't run without leaving their babies behind, and Thornton knew this. He had engineered the perfect prison, one built from maternal bonds and religious pretense, one that required no chains because love itself became the constraint. Chapter 3. The Collapse and Concealment. January 1865 brought the end of everything Reverend Elias Thornton had built, though he refused to acknowledge it until federal soldiers stood in his yard. News of the Emancipation Proclamation had reached Mississippi years earlier, but in isolated plantation districts enforcement was another matter. Thornton continued his covenant system throughout the war, even as reports filtered in about enslaved people liberating themselves, about Union troops occupying southern cities, about the Confederacy's inevitable defeat. When freedom finally came to the Thornton plantation in February 1865, it arrived with little ceremony. A small detachment of Union soldiers, accompanied by a Freedmen's Bureau representative, rode up to inform the preacher that his human property was now free. Thornton's response, recorded in the representative's report, was telling: "These arrangements are blessed by God and cannot be dissolved by military decree." He insisted that the covenant women and their children should remain, arguing that they were part of his family structure rather than simple property. Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca faced an impossible choice. They were legally free, but where could they go? Each woman now had multiple children. Sarah had 4, Dinah had 3, Rebecca had 3. They had no resources, no family networks beyond the plantation, and no guarantee of safety in a region still hostile to black freedom. The Thornton sons, following their father's lead, made promises. They could stay in their cabins, continue receiving food and basic necessities, and the children would be provided for. It sounded like generosity, but was actually another form of control, exploiting the women's maternal instincts and economic vulnerability. Only Sarah made the break. In March 1865, she gathered her children and walked off the property, heading toward the nearest town where the Freedmen's Bureau had established an office. Contemporary records show she registered herself and her 4 children, requesting assistance finding work and housing. The entry notes her former enslaver as Reverend E. Thornton, but makes no mention of Samuel or the covenant arrangement. Sarah never spoke publicly about what she had endured, and she forbade her children from ever returning to the Thornton property. Dinah and Rebecca stayed, trapped by circumstances and the elaborate psychological framework Thornton had constructed around the covenant. They continued living in their separate cabins, though now technically as free people who could theoretically leave at any time. Joshua and Nathaniel Thornton continued their relationships with the women, now framing them as voluntary arrangements between free people. But the power dynamics hadn't changed. The women had no property, no education, no alternatives. They remained dependent on the Thornton family for survival. Reverend Thornton himself began a desperate campaign to preserve his legacy in the face of social collapse. He destroyed most records that explicitly mentioned the covenant system, burning ledger pages that detailed the forced nature of the arrangements. But he couldn't bring himself to destroy the photograph. That daguerreotype represented something he still believed was sacred, proof of a vision he was convinced history would eventually vindicate. Instead of destroying it, he sealed it more carefully, placing it in a metal box along with a few selected pages from his ledger, pages he had edited to make the arrangements sound more voluntary than they actually were. He constructed a false wall in the church basement, creating a hidden cavity just large enough for the metal box. On the exterior surface, he installed normal-looking wooden panels that matched the rest of the basement's construction. The hiding place was ingenious. It would survive structural repairs, routine maintenance, and even significant renovations because no one would suspect the wall's true thickness. Thornton told only Samuel about the hiding place, swearing him to secrecy and insisting that future generations should eventually learn the truth when society was ready to understand. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. By 1867, Reverend Thornton's health was failing. The collapse of his world had broken something fundamental in him, and he died in December of that year, taking most of his secrets with him. His obituary in the local newspaper praised his moral leadership and dedication to Christian principles, with no hint of the program he had engineered. Samuel, Joshua, and Nathaniel inherited the property, which they struggled to maintain in the chaotic Reconstruction era. Dinah and Rebecca continued living on the Thornton property for several more years, their relationships with Joshua and Nathaniel continuing in a strange limbo between coercion and accommodation. By the 1870s, both women had additional children, and the families began to blur. Were they servants, mistresses, or something else entirely? Official records from the period list them variously as domestic workers, residents, or simply don't mention them at all. When Dinah finally left in 1872, taking her children to a neighboring county, She told other black residents that she had spent too many years in hell pretending it was heaven. Rebecca never left. She died on the Thornton property in 1881, buried in an unmarked grave in the small cemetery beyond the slave quarters. Her children stayed in the area, some maintaining complicated relationships with Thornton descendants, others seeking distance from the family that had controlled their mother's entire adult life. The photograph remained hidden, waiting in darkness as decades turned into a century, as the South rewrote its history and buried uncomfortable truths beneath lost cause mythology. Chapter 4. Generations of Silence. For more than a century, the Thornton Church stood as a community fixture in rural Mississippi, its wooden walls weathered but enduring. The congregation dwindled over the decades as population patterns shifted, but the building retained its symbolic importance for the few dozen families who traced their roots to the area. White descendants of the Thornton family maintained the property, organizing occasional cleaning days and basic repairs. They spoke proudly of their ancestors' role in founding the church, though they knew little about the man beyond sanitized family stories. Within black communities in the region, a different version of the Thornton story survived. Elderly residents remembered grandparents speaking about the preacher's women, about forced arrangements and children who grew up not knowing whether they were enslaved or free, property or kin. But these stories were fragmentary, passed down through generations that had learned to be cautious about what they said and to whom. Confronting powerful white families about historical crimes remained dangerous well into the 20th century. Sarah's descendants, who had relocated to Memphis in the early 1900s, preserved the most detailed oral history. Her great-granddaughter, Ella Freeman, became the keeper of family stories in the 1950s and 60s. She recorded interviews with elderly relatives who remembered Sarah's accounts of the plantation years. According to these interviews, Sarah had described the covenant ceremony, the photograph, and Reverend Thornton's insistence that his program was divinely ordained. But Ella's records remained private, stored in boxes and eventually digitized by her granddaughter in the early 2000s. DNA testing in the 21st century began revealing uncomfortable truths that some descendants had long suspected. White families bearing the Thornton name discovered African-American cousins through genealogy websites, connections that contradicted official family trees. Initial reactions ranged from denial to curiosity, with some embracing newly discovered relatives while others refused to acknowledge the implications. The genetic evidence was undeniable. Samuel, Joshua, and Nathaniel had fathered children with enslaved women, and those bloodlines had continued through the generations. But without documentation, without official records, the full story remained fragmented. The white Thornton descendants knew only that their ancestors had owned slaves and that some kind of relationships had occurred. Unfortunate but not unusual for the period, they told themselves. The black descendants knew more but lacked proof that could challenge official narratives. The photograph, the one piece of evidence that could definitively link everything together, remained hidden behind the false wall, unknown to anyone living. By 2020, the Thornton Church was in serious disrepair. Roof damage from a severe storm had exposed interior walls to water, and the small congregation could barely afford basic weatherproofing, let alone comprehensive restoration. A local historical preservation society, interested in maintaining rural churches as cultural landmarks, organized a fundraising campaign and hired a restoration crew to address the most serious structural issues. The crew, led by contractor Michael Stevens, began work in June 2023. The project required examining every section of the building for water damage, rot, and structural weakness. When they reached the basement, Stevens noticed something odd about one wall section. The wood paneling seemed thicker than it should be, and there was a slight gap indicating a possible void behind the visible surface. He assumed it was just poor construction from an earlier repair, but curiosity prompted him to investigate further. Using a moisture meter and density scanner, Stevens confirmed that the wall concealed a hollow space roughly 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. After consulting with the Historical Preservation Society, he carefully removed the outer panels on a Friday afternoon in July. Behind them sat the metal box, covered in dust but remarkably well preserved. The box bore no markings or labels, just a simple clasp block that had corroded over time. Stevens called the Preservation Society's director, Patricia Harrison, who arrived within the hour. Together, they carefully opened the box, revealing its contents: the daguerreotype photograph, several pages of handwritten ledger entries, and a small leather-bound journal. The photograph stunned them immediately. The image quality was remarkable for its age, and the scene it depicted was obviously significant. But they didn't yet understand what they were looking at. Harrison took photographs of the discovery and began researching the ledger entries. The handwriting was identified as Reverend Elias Thornton's through comparison with church records and family Bible entries held by the Historical Society. As she read the coded language about covenant unions and blessed arrangements, the disturbing reality began to emerge. She contacted genealogists familiar with the region's slavery history, including Dr. James Carter, a historian at a nearby university who specialized in enslaved family structures. Dr. Carter arrived on Monday to examine the materials. His analysis was immediate and devastating. This is documentation of forced breeding arrangements disguised as religious ceremony. The photograph is extraordinary. It's rare to have visual evidence of such practices. He identified the 3 women in the photograph as likely enslaved people based on their clothing, positioning, and expressions. The ledger entries, when properly decoded, confirmed that Thornton had engineered marriages between his sons and women he owned, creating a program of reproductive control. The discovery made local news in August 2023, though initial coverage was cautious and incomplete. The Historical Society wanted to investigate further before making definitive claims, and some Thornton descendants immediately pushed back against the emerging narrative, arguing that the interpretation was speculative. But DNA evidence already existed. Dozens of people who had submitted tests to genealogy databases began making connections, realizing that this photograph might explain the genetic links they'd discovered. Chapter 5. Truth confronts denial. The revelation of the Thornton photograph and ledger entries created a firestorm that divided communities along old fault lines. White descendants of the Thornton family reacted with predictable variety. Some expressed genuine shock and shame. Others attempted to contextualize the discovery as complicated history, and a vocal minority insisted the whole interpretation was overblown, arguing that relationships between enslaved people and their enslavers were sometimes consensual, despite the massive power imbalances. Black descendants faced their own complex reckoning. For some, the documentation vindicated stories they'd heard their entire lives, oral histories dismissed by white historians as exaggeration or myth. Ella Freeman's granddaughter, Dr. Monica Washington, now a sociologist in Atlanta, came forward with the recorded interviews her grandmother had conducted decades earlier. Sarah's testimony, preserved in audio recordings from the 1960s, matched the ledger entries with stunning accuracy. She had described the April 1858 ceremony, the photographer, the separate cabins, details that aligned perfectly with Thornton's own records. Dr. James Carter organized a formal research project, bringing together genealogists, historians, and DNA analysts to create a comprehensive picture of the Thornton covenant system and its lasting impact. The team identified over 70 living descendants of Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca, scattered across multiple states. Many had known nothing about their connection to the Thornton family. Others had grown up with fragments of the story. DNA testing confirmed the genetic connections between black and white branches of the family tree, creating an undeniable biological record of what Thornton had engineered. The photograph itself became a powerful tool for confronting historical amnesia. When displayed at a community meeting in October 2023, its impact was visceral. Sarah's face, preserved in silver, spoke across 165 years with heartbreaking clarity. Her expression, blank, distant, resigned, communicated what no amount of written documentation could fully convey. This woman was not celebrating, not consenting, not choosing. She was enduring. Dinah's clenched jaw and Rebecca's barely contained tears told the same story. The 3 Thornton sons, standing behind their father with expressions of dutiful solemnity, looked less like grooms than overseers at a transfer of property. Some white Thornton descendants approached the revelation with genuine humility. Robert Thornton, a great-great-great-grandson of Samuel, attended the community meeting and publicly acknowledged his family's crimes. "I grew up hearing that my ancestor was a righteous man who treated enslaved people fairly. This photograph proves that was a lie. The women in this image were forced into situations they couldn't escape, and my family benefited from that coercion for generations." He committed to supporting efforts to memorialize the Covenant women and advocated for educational programs about the true history of slavery in Mississippi. But others resisted. Margaret Thornton Pierce, another descendant, argued that modern standards couldn't be applied to historical situations, that relationships between enslaved people and enslavers operated under different social rules, that condemning Reverend Thornton was anachronistic. Her position found support among some in the white community, who felt defensive about confronting ugly truths about their heritage. They preferred the comfortable mythology of benevolent enslavers and contented enslaved people, a narrative the photograph brutally demolished. The conflict reached a peak in December 2023 when the Historical Preservation Society proposed converting the Thornton Church into a memorial and educational site focused on enslaved women's experiences. The proposal divided the remaining congregation. Some supported transforming the building into a space for truth-telling and reconciliation. Others, including descendants who had maintained the property for decades, felt their family legacy was being unfairly attacked. They argued that Reverend Thornton had also done good work in the community, and that focusing solely on the covenant system was one-sided. Dr. Monica Washington organized a descendant gathering in January 2024, inviting both Black and white family members to meet and discuss their shared heritage. About 40 people attended, creating an emotionally charged atmosphere. Washington presented her grandmother's recordings of Sarah's testimony, letting the elderly woman's voice fill the room as she described being assigned to Samuel Thornton, the fear she felt, the impossibility of resistance. Several white descendants wept. Others sat in stone-faced silence. The gathering produced no universal consensus, but it did create personal connections that had never existed before. Some descendants exchanged contact information and began exploring their intertwined histories. Others left early, overwhelmed by revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their families. A few Black descendants expressed anger at being asked to sympathize with white relatives' discomfort, arguing that their ancestors had endured infinitely worse than the temporary discomfort of facing historical truth. Media attention intensified through 2024. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a window into rarely documented aspects of slavery's brutality. The photograph circulated widely, appearing in articles, documentaries, and academic presentations. Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca's faces became symbols of countless other enslaved women whose experiences had been deliberately erased from official records. Reverend Thornton became a case study in how religious authority could be twisted to justify systematic sexual exploitation masked as family building. By late 2024, Mississippi state officials announced plans for a formal historical marker at the church site, acknowledging both the building's history and the covenant system Thornton had created. The marker's wording went through multiple revisions as various stakeholders fought over language. The final version, dedicated in March 2025, explicitly named what had occurred. Here, Reverend Elias Thornton forced enslaved women into coerced relationships with his sons as part of a program of reproductive control, documented in a photograph that remained hidden for over 160 years. Chapter 6. Legacy of Truth. The Thornton photograph continues to challenge comfortable narratives about American slavery more than 2 years after its discovery. It has appeared in over 50 academic publications, been featured in 3 documentary films, and serves as a centerpiece in a traveling exhibition about enslaved women's experiences. The image refuses to let viewers look away. The women's faces demand recognition, their silent testimony more powerful than any historical text could provide. In Mississippi, the site has become an unexpected pilgrimage destination for people grappling with slavery's legacy. Descendants of enslaved people come to honor Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca, leaving flowers and notes at the memorial marker. Some white visitors come seeking understanding of how their ancestors participated in or benefited from systems of exploitation. The converted church building now houses a small museum dedicated to telling the full story, including oral histories, DNA evidence, and contemporary responses from descendants on both sides of the color line. Dr. Monica Washington has become the primary spokesperson for Black Thornton descendants, giving lectures and interviews about her great-great-great-grandmother Sarah's courage in leaving the plantation and creating a new life for her children. She emphasizes that Sarah's story represents both exceptional documentation and typical experience. Countless other enslaved women endured similar forced situations, but most left no photographic evidence or written records. The photograph is valuable not because Sarah's suffering was unique, but because it provides proof that can't be dismissed or debated away. The DNA evidence has created lasting bonds between some descendants. Marcus Freeman, Sarah's great-great-great-grandson, developed a friendship with Robert Thornton, and together they've presented at several conferences about confronting shared history. Their presentations don't minimize the power imbalances or pretend that acknowledgement erases harm, but they model how descendants can engage honestly with painful truths. Not all descendants want these connections. Some Black family members find the expectation that they should educate or forgive white relatives exhausting and unfair. Academic interest in the Thornton case has sparked renewed research into similar arrangements across the South. Historians are finding fragmentary evidence of other enslavers who formalized forced relationships, using religious ceremonies or pseudo-legal contracts to create a veneer of legitimacy. These discoveries suggest that Thornton's covenant system, while unusual in its documentation, wasn't unique in its basic structure. Many enslavers engineered reproductive control over enslaved women, seeing their wombs as property that could generate future profits. The photograph's technical quality has also fascinated scholars. Daguerreotypes from the 1850s are relatively rare, and ones depicting enslaved people in domestic contexts are exceptionally uncommon. Most surviving images of enslaved individuals are either formal studio portraits commissioned by enslavers or anthropological documentation created by Northern photographers. The Thornton photograph is neither. It's a private family document that was never meant for public viewing, which makes its candid capture of the women's distress all the more valuable. Legal questions emerged about ownership of the photograph and related materials. Thornton descendants initially claimed the items as family property, but Black descendants argued they should be held in public trust as historical evidence of crimes against their ancestors. After mediation, the materials were donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, where they're now preserved and accessible for research while being respectfully displayed in recognition of the women's suffering. Educational initiatives have expanded beyond Mississippi. The photograph appears in high school history curricula in multiple states, paired with careful discussion about how slavery functioned as a system of total control over enslaved people's bodies, labor, and families. Teachers report that the image sparks difficult but necessary conversations about consent, power, and historical memory. Some students, particularly those whose families have Southern roots, struggle with the cognitive dissonance of seeing their ancestors not as passive or content, but as perpetrators of documented abuse. If this story has already grabbed your attention, leave a like. It helps the story of Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca reach more people. In 2025, a group of descendants, both Black and white, established a memorial fund in honor of the Covenant women. The fund provides scholarships for young people studying African American history, women's studies, and genealogy, with preference given to descendants of enslaved people from Mississippi. The scholarship application asks students to reflect on how hidden histories affect contemporary understanding of race and justice, creating opportunities for new generations to engage with this legacy. The photograph has also influenced broader conversations about reparations and historical accountability. Advocates point to the Thornton case as evidence that slavery's harms weren't abstract or distant. They created specific, traceable impacts that continue affecting descendants today. The DNA evidence shows clear patterns of wealth accumulation in white branches of the family, contrasted with generational poverty in Black branches, all stemming from the same ancestors' reproductive control program. This concrete documentation has energized discussions about how to address persistent inequalities rooted in slavery. Not everyone wants engagement or reconciliation. Some descendants, particularly those like Rebecca's lineage, who stayed on the Thornton property longest and suffered most completely erased identities, want nothing to do with white relatives or memorial projects. They argue that constant focus on white people's feelings about racism distracts from black people's actual experiences and needs. These voices are important reminders that truth-telling doesn't automatically lead to healing, and that descendants of enslaved people owe nothing to their oppressors' descendants. The photograph endures as a silent witness, more powerful than any testimony because it cannot be dismissed or reinterpreted. Sarah, Dinah, and Rebecca look out from 1858 with expressions that transcend time, their dignity maintained despite everything they endured. The truth they held in their hearts, suppressed for 165 years, has finally reached the light,